Hello and welcome to this CSISS webinar on insects and invasive species, the good, the bad, and the ugly. My name is Noel Novotny, and I'm a program assistant with CSISS and an entomologist. So this is one of my favorite things to talk about, and I'm glad to have you joining me here today for this webinar. Before we start, I just want to acknowledge that the Columbia-Shuswap region where we live and work is part of the unceded traditional territories of the Kanaha, Secwepemc, Sinix, and Silks peoples, the first caretakers of these lands. First, I would like to introduce who we are. So CSISS stands for the Columbia-Shuswap Invasive Species Society, and we're an environmental nonprofit that deals with any and all things invasive species. We work in the Columbia-Shuswap Regional District from Chase in the west all the way to Golden in the east, so quite a large area. We have two main goals as an organization. The first is to establish and operate invasive species management programs to prevent the spread of invasive species. And the second is to educate and engage the public and other stakeholders about invasive species and their impacts, which is why we're having this webinar today. But before we get into the insects, we need to have a good understanding of what an invasive species actually is. So invasive species are basically not from here. They've been transported outside of their native range by people. Now this can either happen purposely, such as people moving garden ornamentals such as this knotweed with them, which then escape gardens and become invasive, but it can also happen accidentally. For example, these are zebra mussels, one of North America's worst invasive species. And they were brought to North America accidentally in the ballast waters of tanker ships like this one, completely undetected. But it is simply not enough for a species to be introduced outside of their native range to become invasive. They also have to have negative impacts, and there are several ways that they can do this. They can have negative environmental impacts, such as this common tansy forming monocultures and choking out native plants. They can also have negative economic impacts, such as these zebra mussels clogging pipes and damaging infrastructure. But there can also be negative cultural impacts, such as these puncture vines, which can damage bike tires and lead to closures of the trails we love. So now we have a good understanding of what invasive species are. We also need to have a good understanding of what insects are. Now, I'm sure we all know what an insect is, but there are several important aspects about insects that people don't realize. The main one being their sheer diversity. Insects are the most diverse group of animals on the planet, with over 1 million species being described by science, and an estimated 1 to 3 million more that are currently undiscovered. In contrast, there are only about 50,000 known species of vertebrates and about 400,000 species of plants. So insects dwarf all of those in terms of diversity, if not size. With all those species comes a wide variety of lifestyles that insects can have. You can have pure herbivores to pure predators to omnivores and even parasitoids, which is a life cycle unique to insects, where a parasitoid, such as this wasp here, will lay its egg into another insect, such as a caterpillar. And the larvae will actually eat the caterpillar from the inside while it's still alive. And they will then pupate and leave the caterpillar as adults, killing the caterpillar in the process. Insects can also be found in nearly every terrestrial and freshwater ecosystem on the planet across all continents, including Antarctica. Not only that, but insects can be found in every little part of those ecosystems. So let's imagine you're in a forest. You'll be able to find insects that live exclusively way up high in the canopy, insects that live on the trunks of the trees and inside the wood, insects that live in the understory vegetation, insects that live in the maze of leaf litter on the forest floor, and even insects living underground and in the roots of plants. If, let's say, we have a fast flowing stream through this forest, we'll find insects in every single part of that stream. And in a different part of the forest, we have a stagnant pond or even just a little puddle. We'll find insects in every part of that pond too. And the insects that we find in all those different parts will be totally different species usually. In fact, insects are usually one of the most abundant animals in ecosystems as well. If we were to count every little vertebrate or count every vertebrate in that forest and then count every insect, there'd be hundreds to thousands times more insects. Another way we scientists like to measure abundance is called biomass, where if you were to gather up every individual of a group of animals and weigh them, how much would it weigh? So if you were to gather up every vertebrate in that forest, from the tiniest frog up to 1,000-pound moose and grizzly bears, and weigh them, and then gather up every tiny little insect and weigh them, the insects would actually be many times heavier. Another important aspect about insects are their relationships with plants. Insects and flowering plants evolved at the same time in history and have co-evolved with each other for millions of years, forming intimate relationships. In fact, almost every single plant in the world has an insect that eats it. Some species of insects can eat hundreds of different plants, while others will specialize on eating just one specific plant. Beyond that, insects can specialize on eating just one specific part of that plant. You can have insects that eat just the leaves, others that will just feed on the liquids from the stem, and others that will eat only the roots. So there's lots of specialization and lots of diversity there. As I hope you're getting an understanding for, despite their small size, insects have huge impacts on ecosystems. In fact, they're the basis of pretty much every single terrestrial food web in the world. Famous entomologist E.O. Wilson put it best when he described insects as the little things that run the world. Because of this, insects are super important to the world of invasive species in many different ways. And we'll spend the rest of this webinar going over some of those ways. The first is the good, insects as biocontrols. So insects can actually be part of the solution to invasive species. Biocontrols are insects that we import and release to control invasive species by eating or otherwise killing invasive plants and insects. So they do the work for us. For example, we have this beetle here that feeds on the invasive plant purple loosestrife. And we can also have this parasitoid, which is about to lay its egg into this leek moth, which is an invasive species in eastern Canada. In fact, biocontrols can be one of the most cost-effective ways to control widely established or highly abundant invasive species, as traditional methods such as removing them by hand or catching them or chemical treatment will require way too much manpower and money to be feasible. Unfortunately, there are some drawbacks to biocontrols as well. One is that they are not very effective at eradicating invasive species, as there needs to be a large enough population of the invasive species to sustain the population of the biocontrol. So they're only really good for controlling things that are widely abundant. Another negative is that it can take a really long time for biocontrols to be approved for use in Canada. It takes a lot of research to make sure that the biocontrols won't have any negative impacts on native species and to determine if they can actually survive where they are intended to be introduced. This approval process can sometimes take up to 20 years because there's a lot of research to be done. However, once approved, they can be very successful at controlling invasive species. And we can see examples of this right here in our own backyard. Next time you're going for a walk, make sure to keep an eye out for these biocontrols doing work right here in the CSRD. So spotted knapweed, this plant here, is a super common invasive species here in our region. But thankfully, we have this little weevil that as a biocontrol to help control it. So these weevils will bury into the seed heads and eat the seeds so they can't spread. So next time you see some knapweed, take a close look at some of the seed heads and see if you can see these little holes burrowed into them. That's actually evidence of the seed weevils doing their work. Another common biocontrol here in the CSRD is these shiny iridescent trisid mellid beetles on St. John's wort. So these beetles were actually the first biocontrols introduced in BC to control invasive plants all the way back in the 1950s. However, not all insects are quite as helpful as these two. We also have the bad, insects as invasive species. So unfortunately, all that diversity that we talked about earlier also means that there's lots of opportunities for insects to become invasive. We can have huge predators like this northern giant hornet, all the way to these tiny little herbivores like the spotted winged Drosophila. Another aspect that makes insects tricky as invasive species is that, well, they're tiny and they like to move around, making them prime hitchhikers. So consider these rice weevils here, which are barely the size of a grain of rice. If you were transporting some bags of rice around and there are just a couple of these weevils in there, it'll be almost impossible to detect them, and they'd probably end up hitching a ride with you. And in fact, this is exactly what happened. These rice weevils are native to India, but have now spread across the entire world due to the global trade of rice. Being small and mobile also makes insects much harder to control than other invasives like plants. With plants, we can usually just go out and count them, and we can know they'll be generally in the same place from year to year. Makes them easy to go back and control them. Whereas with insects, we need to use specialized sampling techniques like using nets or traps to find them in the first place. And if we come back a week later, there's a possibility they might already be gone. They might have moved somewhere else. It makes them a lot trickier to control. Invasive insects can also impact many different industries and ecosystems, including forestry, where insects like emerald ash borers, which we'll talk about in more detail later, can kill large swaths of trees. Agriculture, where pests like this apple maggot, which has been found in the lower mainland and near Prince George, can devastate fruit crops. Gardens and the ornamental industry can also be infected by invasive insects like these scarlet lily beetles, which are invasive in eastern Canada and voraciously eat lilies and other common garden plants. Invasive insects can also act as disease vectors, greatly impacting human health. They can either spread diseases which were already native to the area, or they can bring new diseases with them. For example, this Aedes aegypti mosquito, which is invasive in the southern United States, can transmit diseases such as Zika, dengue, and yellow fever. And of course, invasive insects can also just act as general nuisances. For example, this is the European fire ant, which has been found on Vancouver Island and in the lower mainland. So this ant likes to make its nests in grassy areas such as parks, but they're very aggressive and have a painful sting. So it just makes those parks less enjoyable for us to use. Finally, most invasive insects also have some sort of general negative effects to ecosystem health. For example, the invasive Argentine ant, which has been found in Victoria, can form massive super colonies that take up to 650 square meters and can contain around 5 million ants, allowing them to outcompete native insects and greatly disrupt food webs. And unfortunately, we of course have invasive insects right here in the CSRD as well. So I'm going to highlight a few of the worst ones that we have around here. The first is the brown marmoted stink bug, which was introduced to Pennsylvania in 2001, but has since spread to the majority of North America. So these bugs overwinter as adults and like to seek out warm spots such as in our homes and vehicles, which make them great accidental hitchhikers. As it's starting to become fall and get a little bit cooler now, you might see some of these trying to make their way into your house. Additionally, they can feed on over 100 different species of plants, which has also helped them to spread all over North America so quickly. They are major pests of fruit trees in particular, and even cause about $37 million in damage to the apple industry in the Mid-Atlantic states alone every single year. These bugs can be identified by their shield-shaped bodies with this large triangle on the back that we call a scutellum. And they also have this brown marbled coloring, hence their name. They also have two white bands on their antennae here, which distinguish them from some of our native species that look quite alike. Not all stink bugs are invasive, and our native brown stink bug down here in the bottom left looks quite similar to the invasive brown marmoted one. However, it does not have those two white bands on their antennae. We also have the native western conifer seed bug, which you might also see trying to make their way into your homes this fall. So this also looks very similar, and except they have a narrower body, these widened extensions on their hind legs, and they also lack the white bands on their antennae. The next invasive insect we'll highlight is balsam woody adelgid, which is a very atypical looking insect. All these white splotches on this tree here are actually insects. These adelgids look like tiny aphids, but once they find a spot on a fir tree that they like, they'll excrete this tufty, waxy substance to protect them, and then won't move for the rest of their lives. Their saliva is actually toxic to the trees, and the subalpine firs we have in the high mountains around here are particularly susceptible. Their saliva will cause the needles of the trees to yellow and drop off, the branch nodes and the terminal buds to swell up, like you can see here, and eventually this can even lead to the tree's death. In fact, if you're ever heading by the Rogers Pass Discovery Center, you'll probably notice a bunch of dead trees right around the area, which were actually killed by an infestation of these insects several years ago. The last invasive insect that you can find in the CSRD that we'll talk about today is the spotted winged Drosophila. So these fruit flies were found in BC in 2009 and have since spread to every major fruit growing region in the province. Unlike most fruit flies, which feed on rotting fruit, these feed on fresh fruit. Females have this saw-like organ you can see in this zoomed in picture here, and they use this to saw into fresh fruit and lay their eggs. The larvae then develop, like we can see in this blueberry here, and they make the fruit unsuitable for human consumption. So these tiny little flies can actually cause around $500 million in damage every year to the fruit industry in the US alone. So they're quite destructive. They can be distinguished from your typical fruit flies by these dark spots on the wings of the males. The females, unfortunately, just look like your average fruit fly, unless you're a keen entomologist and you got a microscope sitting at home to look for that little saw organ. But otherwise, just look for the spots on the males. So the invasive insects we have around here can be pretty bad, but thankfully, we still don't have the ugly, the highest priority invasive insects. So these mean mugs you see here represent some of North America's worst invasive species, which can impose huge economic costs in the realm of billions of dollars. Of course, they can also have immense negative effects on ecosystems, can even permanently change ecosystem states. So they can never go back to their original state ever again. The goal for these highest priority invasives is to prevent them at all costs, because unfortunately, once they become established, they are pretty much impossible to get rid of. Thankfully, the province has what we call Early Detection Rapid Response, or EDRR protocols for most of these species. The province constantly monitors for these species, so if they are detected, we hopefully have found them very early in their process of invasion, and we can put in place pre-built plans to rapidly eradicate them before they become established. So let's highlight some of the big baddies of the invasive insect world. The first high priority species we'll talk about is the spongy moth, or formerly known as the gypsy moth. So there's both an Asian subspecies and a European subspecies of the spongy moth. And the European one was introduced to Eastern North America all the way back in the 1850s by an entomologist who purposely brought the moths to North America to breed with silk moths so he could better farm silk. However, he left the window open one day and they escaped. And Eastern North America's forests have never been the same since. Spongy moth is a major defoliator, which can eat the leaves of 300 plus different species of trees, including both hardwoods and softwoods. They can sometimes even completely strip the tree of their leaves, like we can see in this picture here. This, of course, has major impacts to the forestry industry, causing about $418 million of damage in the United States every single year. As you can imagine, stripping the trees of the majority of their leaves also has immense negative impacts to the ecosystems, as the forest floors are exposed to large amounts of sunlight that they aren't really built to tolerate. Thankfully, this species spreads very slowly naturally, as the females, which are the white ones here, actually cannot fly despite having wings. Unfortunately, humans make up for that a little bit, and they transport the moths larger distances by transporting firewood that has their egg masses attached. That's why it's important to never transport firewood outside the region where it was harvested. And with spongy moth, we also have a fight on two fronts. So we have the European subspecies that is established in the east, as far west as Ontario, and is slowly spreading further and further west. But we also have the Asian subspecies, which has been discovered several times here on the west coast, but thankfully has been eradicated every single time. However, there is the constant threat of reintroduction, as transport ships from Asia can bring the moth over. And in fact, ships from certain regions of Asia where there are lots of spongy moths actually have to be inspected by entomologists to make sure there are no hitchhiking moths on board before they're allowed to land in port in BC. The next species we'll talk about is the Japanese beetle. These beetles have been introduced many times to Eastern North America as far back as the 1920s, but rigorous quarantine and control programs have kept them from becoming widely established. These large iridescent beetles are quite pretty. They're kind of like little jewels, really, but they can cause quite a lot of damage. The adults are defoliators and can eat the leaves of over 250 different plant species, skeletonizing the leaves, as you can see here. The larvae live underground, and they eat or feed on the roots of grasses, significantly damaging lawns and costing the turf and ornamental industry over $450 million in damage every single year. As you can see here, the damage they cause to lawns can be quite extensive. Unfortunately, in 2017, a small isolated population of these Japanese beetles were found in an area of Vancouver. But thankfully, city officials quickly detected them and have enacted quarantine programs which have limited the spread of the beetles so far, and eradication efforts are underway. The next species, the spotted lanternfly, is one of North America's newest invasive species, only being introduced to Pennsylvania in the United States in 2012. These brightly colored bugs feed on the sap of a wide variety of hardwood species, and again have large impacts to the grape and wine industry. Their feeding on trees also makes the trees very susceptible to fungal infection, threatening tree health. As this species is fairly new to North America, their economic impacts have not yet been properly measured, but their population sizes have exploded in just a few short years, and they've already spread through several states in the eastern United States. The nymphs, or babies of these bugs, feed on a wide variety of tree species, but the adults feed almost exclusively on the tree of heaven, which is also an invasive species. So this is a prime example of invasive species facilitating each other's invasions. Without the invasive tree or heaven, it would be much more difficult for the spotted lanternflies to establish and spread throughout North America. But because the trees already exist here, they already have hosts, and that facilitates their spread. This is just one more reason why we should work hard to prevent the introduction of all invasive species, as it can cause cascading negative effects, such as facilitating each other. And now we talk about this green bullet-shaped beetle, the emerald ash borer. So it is one of the world's most invasive forest pests. These beetles feed on ash trees and can kill up to 99% of ash trees in an area. In fact, these beetles have already killed over 100 million trees since their introduction to Detroit, Michigan in the 1990s. And of course, they spread through a lot of North America since then. Experts actually believe that over the next 50 years, it is likely that emerald ash borers will actually result in the complete extinction of ash trees from North America, wiping the entire genus of plants from the continent. This, of course, has huge negative impacts to the forestry industry, as a wide variety of goods are made from ash trees. Additionally, ash trees are one of the most common trees planted by cities as shade trees in parks and along boulevards and sidewalks. So cities where emerald ash borer are found have to either cut down and replant nearly every tree in the city, or simply have cities without shade trees. Not only does this have an economic cost of its own, but it also has costs to human health, as shade trees lower temperatures in cities and improve city air quality. The total estimated economic cost of these emerald ash borers is an astounding $20 billion plus. So you can easily see why this is one of the worst invasive species in the world. Just this summer, emerald ash borers have been found west of the Rocky Mountains for the first time in Oregon. And unfortunately, their spread to the West Coast or to the rest of the West Coast is highly likely. So make sure to keep your eyes out for these beetles in BC. The best way to identify the presence of these beetles is either to look for their quite distinctive adults, or you look for these characteristic D-shaped exit holes that the adults leave in trees when they exit the trees. The last invasive insect we'll talk about today is the Asian longhorned beetle. So these black and white beetles feed on a variety of hardwood trees, but maple trees are particularly susceptible to infestation. The darn beetles are going after our national tree. This not only has negative impacts to the forestry industry, but also the maple syrup industry. Like many other forest pests, they're primarily transported by humans moving firewood and other untreated wood products, which is something we should never do. But the story of these beetles show us that the world of invasive insects isn't all doom and gloom, however. They have established twice in Ontario in 2003 and 2013, but thanks to concerted efforts by a variety of stakeholders, the beetles were eradicated both times, and none have been found since 2020. So we get to end it off with a success story. Thanks to dedicated monitoring and well-constructed rapid response protocols, we can prevent even the worst invasive species, such as these Asian longhorn beetles. However, the threat of reintroduction is always there, so we have to be constantly vigilant. So how can we as members of the public help prevent invasive species and lead to more success stories? Well, the first is simply to be aware, which I hope this webinar has helped you with, especially for insects, which are more commonly overlooked as compared to plants, because people like gardeners are usually very knowledgeable about plants. But for insects, it really pays to know about the possible threats, what they look like, and how they spread. I also hope this webinar leads you to have a greater appreciation for insects in general. Inspire you to take some time to observe the insects around you every once in a while, as it may help you to identify new invaders. And if you hopefully never see any, you'll also get to see some pretty cool insects in the process. The next thing we can do is to be very diligent about preventing unintended hitchhikers from coming along with us. Before you travel anywhere, make sure to inspect your things and your vehicle for any sneaky ride-along insects. And make sure to never transport firewood or any other untreated wood products outside the area they were harvested from. When it comes to firewood, buy local, burn local. And finally, if you do see any suspected invasive species, make sure to report them. So this can either be done through the handy Report Invasives app, which you can find on the App Store. It's quite nice. It's kind of picture-based, so it can actually help you to identify things as you see them. But unfortunately, I will say the insect section of the app is a little bit lacking, but it's good for lots of other invasive species. But you can also report your sightings directly to us at our website at Columbia-Shuswap invasives.org/report invasive species. At CSISS, we're a very small organization with only 6 employees and the entire CSRID to cover, and lots of other um, invasive species organizations are similar. So having the public be our eyes on the ground for invasive makes a really big difference. So thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar and learned a lot, hopefully. If you have any questions or want more information, you can contact us at our toll-free number or our email. We also have lots more information about invasive species on our website and news about upcoming CSIS events as well. So thanks again, and have a wonderful rest of your day.